more than likely, if you have children and number one, they start listening in church and your church actually uses the Bible, or two, your children start reading the Bible for themselves, there's coming a day when they are going to say to you, Daddy, what's a circumcision? Your first response is going to be something along the lines of, well, are you sure you want to know? So at that point, either your child is going to want to know, or a couple years later, after they've blacked out that whole experience, they're going to come back and say to you, Daddy, what's a circumcision? At this point, you can begin by saying, well, little boys, when they're born, have a thing called a penis. And at this point, your girls will cease being interested and will wish they had never asked this question and will immediately change the subject to something else. Your little boys will, of course, start laughing. So you'll have to pause anywhere between 5 to 37 minutes, depending on the maturity level of your son, before you can proceed any further. And you say, when little boys are born, they have a penis, and there's a piece of skin on the top of it there, and they cut that off, and that's called circumcision, cutting off the little piece of skin off of the little boy's penis. Now, more than likely, your little child is going to give you the impression that they fully understand what you just told them, and they're going to change the subject. And, of course, they're going to black out that experience. Until a couple years later, they're going to hear about it again, and they're going to say, Dad, what's a circumcision? And you're going to say to them, well, when little boys are born, they have this piece of skin on their penis, and their kids are going to say, oh, yeah, I remember that. And then they're going to say, well, why did they do that? And you're going to say to them, well, because God said so. And they're going to ask the question, well, why did God tell them to do that? And you're going to say these three words, I don't know. It has something to do with a covenant that God made between himself and Abraham and the people of Israel, and Moses told them to do it in the law, and it's something that they were supposed to do. I don't know why. That's what he said to do, so they did it. So more than likely, your children will be satisfied with that answer, and they will black out that experience entirely. And a couple years later, they will say to you again, Dad, well, what is circumcision? And you're going to say to them, well, little boys have a penis, and there's a piece of skin on it. Oh, yeah, I remember that. I remember that. Now, we don't have to do that, do we? And you will then say to them, no, God never told us to do that. In the new covenant, that was part of the sign that God made between the covenant between himself and the people of Israel. That was something that they did. We don't have to do that today. Oh, well, that's good. Yes, my child, it is. Your children will have now gotten the point enough to know that this is an uncomfortable subject, and we probably shouldn't bring it up ever again. But there's coming a time when you're going to be reading some of the books of the Apostle Paul, and he's going to start talking about circumcision, and he's going to tell you that circumcision is that of the heart and not of the flesh. And so one of your children is going to ask you, Father, why is circumcision of the heart and not of the flesh? Yes, haven't your children asked you that question? Of course they have. And you are going to say to them, well, that's because the people of Israel, when they did the circumcision deal there, that kind of became their whole thing. And they figured, well, since I was 8 days old, I was circumcised, I must be one of God's people. But the Apostle Paul and many other writers of Scripture, because in fact Paul is quoting the Old Testament when he talks about circumcision of the heart, God is driving at the point there that it's not simply, salvation is not simply something that happens because you did something one time. Salvation is something of the heart. Do you really love God? Do you really love his word? Do you really love what he has done for you? That's really the issue, not whether or not your little flesh did some little thing. And at that point, your child will say, oh, yes, Father, I totally understand what you are speaking of. Thank you so much, Father, for your spiritual insight and guidance all of these years. And you will say, of course, son, that's what I'm here for.